In the early hours of December 16, 1944, a dense winter fog settled over the forests of the Ardennes, a rugged region of hills and pine trees stretching across Belgium and Luxembourg. American soldiers along the front believed the sector was relatively quiet. Many of the units stationed there were exhausted divisions that had been moved to the Ardennes to rest after months of fighting across France. The thick woods, narrow roads, and freezing weather made the area seem unlikely for a major offensive. But deep behind the German lines, thousands of vehicles were already moving into position. Engines were kept silent whenever possible, headlights were covered, and orders were whispered rather than shouted. Germany was preparing one final massive gamble in the West. The man behind this plan was Adolf Hitler. By late 1944, Germany was losing the war on every front. In the east, the Soviet Union was pushing relentlessly toward Germany's borders. In the west, Allied forces had broken out from Normandy and were advancing across France. German industry was being bombed daily, fuel supplies were collapsing, and experienced soldiers were becoming harder to replace. Yet Hitler believed there was still one chance to turn the war around. His idea was bold and extremely risky. Launch a surprise attack through the Ardennes, smash through the thin American lines, race toward the Belgian port city of Antwerp, and split the Allied armies in half. If successful, the attack could trap several Allied armies and force the Western Allies to negotiate. German planners knew it would require speed, surprise, and a powerful armored spearhead. Elite panzer divisions were assembled for the offensive, including many of Germany's most feared tanks. Among them were the Panther tanks, officially known as the Panzer V Panther. These vehicles were among the most advanced tanks of the war. With thick, sloped armor and a powerful 75mm high-velocity gun, the Panther could destroy most Allied tanks at long distances. Its armor made it extremely difficult to penetrate from the front. German tank crews trusted the Panther as one of their most formidable weapons. But even powerful machines depend on the situation in which they're used. The Ardennes was not open farmland like the Eastern Front. It was a maze of forests, villages, rivers, and narrow roads. Heavy armored columns had limited room to maneuver. If traffic jams formed or bridges were destroyed, even the strongest tank could become trapped. German commanders understood the risks, but they also believed the element of surprise would compensate for the difficult terrain. When the attack finally began before dawn on December 16th, the silence of the forest was shattered by thousands of artillery shells. German guns opened fire along a wide stretch of the American front, creating confusion and panic among many of the defending units. Infantry divisions moved forward through the snow, followed by columns of tanks and armored vehicles. Within hours, German troops had broken through several sections of the American lines. Entire units found themselves surrounded or cut off as German forces pushed deeper into the Ardennes. For American soldiers caught in the opening moments of the offensive, the situation was chaotic. Telephone lines were cut, radio communication was unreliable, and many commanders struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. At first, some officers believed the attack might be a local counterstrike, but as reports continued to arrive, the truth became clear. This was not a small operation. It was a massive offensive involving hundreds of thousands of German troops and thousands of vehicles. One of the key locations in the unfolding battle was the small Belgian town of Bastogne. Although it looked insignificant on the map, Bastogne sat at the center of several critical roads that crossed the Ardennes region. In winter conditions, these roads were essential for moving supplies, tanks, and reinforcements. Any army controlling Bastogne would control the movement of large forces across the battlefield. German planners understood this perfectly. Capturing Bastogne quickly was considered essential to the success of the entire offensive. But war rarely unfolds exactly as planned. The German advance faced immediate challenges. Traffic jams formed as tanks, trucks, and artillery competed for the same narrow roads. Bridges had to be captured intact. Fuel shortages slowed many units, and despite the initial surprise, American resistance began to stiffen. Small groups of soldiers fought stubbornly in villages and forests, delaying the German timetable hour by hour. At the same time, Allied commanders were rushing to understand the scale of the crisis. Among them was General George C. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army. Patton had built a reputation as one of the most aggressive and mobile commanders in the American military. His army had advanced rapidly across France during the summer of 1944, often covering distances that surprised both enemies and allies. Patton believed strongly in speed, initiative, and relentless pressure against the enemy. When news of the German offensive reached Allied headquarters, many commanders were shocked. The attack had come through terrain that had been considered unsuitable for a large armored assault. But Patton immediately began thinking about how to respond. He understood that the German breakthrough was dangerous, but he also believed that a rapid counterattack could disrupt the offensive before it reached its full momentum. Meanwhile, German armored units continued pushing westward. Panther tanks rolled through forest roads, their engines echoing between the trees. These machines were powerful, but they were also large and heavy. In the narrow roads of the Ardennes, their movements often depended on long columns of vehicles moving one behind another. If the lead vehicle was destroyed or blocked, even the strongest tank could become trapped. German commanders understood the risks, but they also believed the element of surprise would compensate for the difficult terrain. When the weather played a crucial role in the early days of the battle, thick clouds and winter fog grounded Allied aircraft, preventing fighter bombers from attacking German columns. This gave the German advance a temporary advantage. Without constant air attacks, their armored formations could move more freely during the first days of the offensive. Yet even with these advantages, the German plan depended on speed. The longer the battle continued, the more time the Allies would have to bring reinforcements into the region. Every delay increased the risk that the offensive would lose momentum. Commanders on both sides understood this race against time. American units began regrouping around key crossroads and towns. Engineers blew bridges to slow the advance. Small anti-tank teams set up ambushes along forest roads. In some cases, a handful of soldiers with a single anti-tank gun managed to delay entire German columns for hours. These small acts of resistance gradually disrupted the carefully planned timetable of the German offensive. And at the center of this growing storm stood Bastogne. As German forces advanced around the town, American units were ordered to move toward it and hold the crossroads at all costs. Reinforcements from airborne divisions were rushed into the area, often traveling through freezing weather with little preparation. Trucks packed with soldiers drove through snow-covered roads toward the sound of distant artillery. Inside Bastogne, soldiers began preparing defensive positions in the forests surrounding the town. Foxholes were dug into frozen ground. Machine guns were positioned along likely approaches. Ammunition was distributed, though supplies were limited. The men understood that German armor would eventually arrive, and they would have to face it with whatever weapons they had available. Meanwhile, German commanders believed they were still advancing toward victory. Their armored divisions had punched a large bulge into the Allied front lines. This dramatic shape on military maps would soon give the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Bulge. For a brief moment, it appeared that Germany had regained the initiative on the Western Front. But beneath the surface of that early success, serious problems were already emerging. The offensive was slowing. Fuel shortages were becoming critical. American resistance was growing stronger in key areas, and Allied commanders were beginning to organize a coordinated response that would soon bring new armored units into the fight. Within days, the forests and snowy fields around Bastogne would become the stage for a deadly contest between two very different approaches to armored warfare. On one side were heavy German tanks designed for firepower and armor. On the other side were fast American vehicles built around a completely different philosophy: speed, maneuverability, and aggressive ambush tactics. The clash between these ideas would soon produce encounters that seemed almost unbelievable. German tank crews would report being attacked from unexpected directions. Powerful Panthers would struggle to react against enemies that appeared, fired, and disappeared in seconds. What began as Germany's last great offensive would slowly transform into a battle where mobility and quick thinking could be just as important as armor and firepower. And in the frozen forests near Bastogne, the outcome of those encounters would help shape the final months of the war in Europe.
In the days after the German offensive began in December 1944, confusion spread across Allied headquarters. Reports arriving from the Ardennes described large numbers of German tanks moving through terrain that had long been considered unsuitable for a major armored attack. Entire American units had been pushed back, some had been surrounded, and the front line that once stretched in a straight line across the map was now bulging outward under the weight of the German advance. The situation was serious enough that senior Allied commanders gathered urgently to decide how to respond. Among them was General George S. Patton, commander of the United States Third Army. Patton was known for his aggressive leadership style and his belief that speed in warfare could often decide battles before they even began. His army had already demonstrated this earlier in 1944 during the rapid breakout from Normandy, when his forces advanced across France at a pace that surprised even Allied planners. But now the situation was different. His army was positioned far to the south of the German breakthrough, moving east toward the German border. Turning his forces north toward the crisis in the Ardennes would require one of the most complex maneuvers of the war. At a high-level meeting on December 19, Allied commanders tried to understand the scale of the German attack. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower asked each commander what they could realistically do to stop the offensive. Many officers believed it would take days simply to reorganize their forces. Some thought the Germans might already be too far advanced to stop quickly. Patton surprised the room. Instead of asking for time to prepare, he calmly stated that his Third Army could attack north within 48 hours. The response shocked many of the officers present. Moving an entire army across winter roads, reversing its direction of advance, and coordinating thousands of vehicles and soldiers normally required weeks of planning. But Patton had already anticipated the possibility of a German counteroffensive in the Ardennes. Days earlier, he had quietly ordered his staff to prepare contingency plans for turning the army north if necessary. Because of this preparation, the moment the decision was made, orders could begin moving immediately through the chain of command. Units that had been preparing to attack east suddenly received instructions to change direction and move north toward the Belgian town of Bastogne. Maps were redrawn, supply routes were reorganized, and convoys of vehicles began shifting their routes across frozen roads. The maneuver that followed became one of the most famous operational movements of the war. Nearly 250,000 soldiers of the Third Army had to pivot their entire direction of movement by 90 degrees. Thousands of trucks, artillery pieces, fuel tankers, tanks, and armored vehicles were now heading into the Ardennes instead of toward Germany. The success of this movement depended on coordination and discipline. A single blocked road or broken bridge could create massive delays for the entire army. Winter conditions made the task even harder. Snow covered many roads, and temperatures dropped well below freezing at night. Drivers struggled with poor visibility, icy surfaces, and long hours behind the wheel. Some convoys moved almost continuously for 2 days, stopping only briefly for fuel or mechanical repairs. Soldiers riding in open trucks wrapped themselves in blankets and coats, trying to stay warm as the vehicles pushed through the darkness. Despite these difficulties, the movement continued with remarkable speed. Military police directed traffic at key intersections to prevent jams. Engineers worked constantly to repair damaged roads and strengthen bridges so heavy vehicles could cross safely. Supply units struggled to keep fuel and ammunition flowing to the advancing columns. Every part of the army had to function efficiently for the maneuver to succeed. At the same time, the situation in Bastogne was becoming increasingly desperate. German armored units were approaching the town from multiple directions, attempting to seize the vital road junction before large numbers of American reinforcements could arrive. Inside Bastogne, elements of the U.S. 101st Airborne Division and other scattered units were already preparing defensive positions in the surrounding forests and fields. The soldiers defending Bastogne faced extremely difficult conditions. They were short on winter clothing, ammunition, and medical supplies. German artillery regularly shelled their positions, and armored patrols probed the defenses from different directions. But the defenders understood the importance of holding the town. As long as Bastogne remained in American hands, the German advance would face a major obstacle in the center of the battlefield. Meanwhile, Patton's advancing units were racing against time. Every hour mattered. If the Germans captured Bastogne before the Third Army arrived, they could open the roads necessary to push deeper toward the west. But if American forces reached the town first and reinforced its defenders, the German timetable would begin to collapse. The first elements of the Third Army began reaching the outskirts of the battlefield, just as the German offensive was reaching its maximum depth. Armored divisions and tank destroyer battalions moved into position along likely routes of German advance. These vehicles included vehicles designed specifically to counter enemy tanks using speed and maneuver rather than heavy armor. American doctrine had developed a unique approach to fighting enemy armor. Instead of relying entirely on heavily armored tanks, the United States Army had created specialized tank destroyer units. These formations were equipped with fast, lightly armored vehicles carrying powerful guns capable of penetrating German tank armor. Their purpose was not to engage in slow, head-on duels, but to move quickly across the battlefield, ambush enemy tanks from favorable positions, and relocate before being targeted. Among the vehicles arriving near the front were the fast and highly mobile M18 Hellcat tank destroyers. Built around the idea that mobility could be more valuable than armor, the Hellcat had a powerful 76mm gun mounted on a very light chassis. Its armor was thin compared to most tanks of the war, but its speed was extraordinary. On roads, it could reach speeds of more than 50 miles per hour, making it one of the fastest armored fighting vehicles of the entire conflict. This speed would soon prove crucial in the dense forests of the Ardennes. German units advancing through narrow roads often had limited visibility and little room to maneuver. A fast vehicle capable of striking from unexpected directions could disrupt entire columns of heavier tanks. As the Third Army moved closer to Bastogne, the scale of the battlefield continued expanding. German forces were still attempting to push westward, but the momentum of the offensive was slowing. Fuel shortages, traffic congestion, and determined American resistance were beginning to take their toll. Every day that passed allowed more Allied units to arrive in the region. Patton's decision to turn his army north was now beginning to influence the course of the battle. Instead of facing scattered resistance, German armored units would soon encounter organized American formations moving aggressively toward the front. The clash between these forces would produce intense fighting across the forests and villages surrounding Bastogne. For the soldiers and tank crews involved, the coming battles would be fought in freezing temperatures, among snow-covered trees and narrow roads where visibility was limited and danger could appear from almost any direction. In such conditions, the traditional advantages of heavy armor were not always decisive. The ability to move quickly, reposition rapidly, and strike from unexpected angles could determine which crews survived and which did not. Within this environment, fast American tank destroyers were about to demonstrate how mobility and aggressive tactics could challenge even the most powerful German tanks.
and as the battle intensified around Bastogne, the race that Patton had started with his rapid maneuver would soon lead directly into a series of deadly encounters that German tank crews would struggle to understand.
By the winter of 1944, American armored doctrine had already taken a very different path from that of Germany. While German engineers focused on building increasingly heavy tanks with thicker armor and larger guns, the United States Army had developed another idea for dealing with enemy armor. Instead of matching heavy tanks with even heavier tanks, American planners believed speed and flexibility could be just as powerful on the battlefield. Out of this philosophy came a specialized type of vehicle known as the tank destroyer. The concept behind the tank destroyer was simple but radical. Intelligence analysts believed that when enemy tanks attacked, they would often do so in large, concentrated formations. Rather than spreading anti-tank weapons across every unit, the U.S. Army decided to create mobile battalions whose sole purpose was to hunt and destroy enemy armor. These units would move quickly to threatened sectors, set up ambushes, and eliminate attacking tanks before they could break through defensive lines. Early tank destroyers had mixed results. Some were built on modified tank chassis, while others were improvised designs mounted on half-tracks. But American engineers continued refining the idea, searching for a vehicle that combined powerful firepower with extremely high mobility. The result was the M18 Hellcat, a machine that would become one of the fastest armored fighting vehicles ever built during the war. When soldiers first saw the Hellcat, many were surprised by how light it appeared compared to traditional tanks. The armor was thin, sometimes less than an inch thick in certain areas. This was not a vehicle designed to absorb hits from heavy enemy guns. Instead, its designers made a deliberate trade-off. By reducing armor weight, they were able to create an incredibly fast and agile vehicle capable of reaching speeds that most tanks could not even approach. Powered by a radial aircraft-type engine, the Hellcat could reach speeds of around 55 miles per hour on roads. For an armored vehicle weighing over 17 tons, this was astonishing. In many situations, it could move almost as fast as some military trucks. Acceleration was also impressive, allowing the vehicle to rapidly relocate after firing. On a battlefield where seconds could determine survival, that speed could mean everything. The Hellcat's main weapon was a 76mm gun capable of penetrating the armor of many German tanks when fired from the right angle or distance. It was not as large as the massive guns mounted on some heavy tanks, but it was accurate, reliable, and deadly when used properly. Combined with the vehicle's speed, it allowed Hellcat crews to perform quick attacks against enemy armor before withdrawing to safer positions. Another distinctive feature of the Hellcat was its open-topped turret. Unlike many tanks, the turret had no roof, leaving the crew partially exposed to the elements. At first glance, this might seem like a serious weakness, but the open design offered several important advantages. It reduced weight, improved visibility for the crew, and allowed faster communication between the commander and surrounding infantry. In fast-moving battles where awareness of the environment was critical, this visibility could provide a real advantage. Of course, the open turret also meant that Hellcat crews were vulnerable to artillery fragments, small arms fire, and harsh weather. During the winter battles in the Ardennes, this design exposed crews directly to freezing temperatures and snow. Many soldiers riding inside these vehicles spent long hours enduring the cold wind while scanning the forests for signs of enemy armor. Despite these hardships, the crews who operated the Hellcat quickly developed a strong respect for the machine. Its agility allowed them to perform maneuvers that heavier tanks simply could not match. A Hellcat could dash down a road, fire from an ambush position, and relocate before enemy gunners had time to aim properly. In experienced hands, this speed turned the vehicle into a deadly predator.
German Panther crews, especially those operating powerful vehicles like the Panther tank, were used to relying on their thick armor and long-range firepower. The Panther was designed to destroy enemy tanks at distances where it could remain relatively safe from return fire. Its sloped armor provided strong protection from the front, and its high-velocity gun was extremely effective against many Allied armored vehicles. But the Panther also had weaknesses. It was a large and heavy machine, weighing more than twice as much as the Hellcat. In open terrain, this might not be a major disadvantage, but in the narrow roads and forests of the Ardennes, maneuverability became far more important. Turning the large turret of a Panther or repositioning the entire vehicle took valuable time, especially if the crew was surprised by an attack from the side. American tank destroyer doctrine took advantage of these weaknesses. Instead of attacking directly from the front, Hellcat crews were trained to strike from flanking positions. They would hide behind trees, buildings, or terrain features, waiting for enemy tanks to pass by. Once a vulnerable side or rear angle appeared, the Hellcat would fire quickly and then relocate before the enemy could respond. Speed allowed these crews to perform what sometimes felt like a deadly game of movement across the battlefield. A Hellcat might appear suddenly from one direction, fire its gun, and disappear behind cover moments later. If the enemy attempted to chase it, the lighter vehicle could often outrun heavier tanks and reposition somewhere else entirely. Training played a critical role in making these tactics effective. Tank destroyer crews practiced rapid target acquisition, quick firing procedures, and coordinated movements with other vehicles. Communication between crews allowed them to create ambush zones where multiple Hellcats could strike the same target from different angles. In these situations, even heavily armored tanks could become vulnerable. By late 1944, several tank destroyer battalions equipped with the M18 Hellcat were operating with American forces in Europe. Their crews had already gained experience fighting German armor in France and Belgium. But the coming battles in the Ardennes would test these vehicles in one of the most difficult environments of the war. The forests around Bastogne were filled with narrow roads and limited visibility. Snow covered the ground, and fog often reduced sight lines to only a few hundred meters. For large armored formations, these conditions could create confusion and slow reaction times. But for fast vehicles capable of moving quickly between positions, the terrain offered opportunities for surprise. As American forces prepared to confront the advancing German units, Hellcat crews understood that their survival would depend on using every advantage their vehicle offered. They could not rely on thick armor to protect them from powerful German guns. Instead, they would rely on speed, positioning, and the element of surprise. Soon, these tactics would be tested against some of the most feared tanks in the German arsenal. Encounters would occur suddenly, sometimes at very close distances within the forests and villages of the Ardennes. In these moments, the outcome of the fight could depend on which crew saw the other first and which vehicle could move faster. For German Panther crews, expecting traditional armored battles fought at long range, the experience could be disorienting. Instead of facing slow, predictable opponents, they would encounter enemies that moved quickly, struck unexpectedly, and vanished before retaliation could arrive. In the freezing winter landscape around Bastogne, the stage was being set for a series of encounters where mobility and timing would challenge the dominance of heavy armor. The fast American tank destroyers were about to prove that on certain battlefields, speed could become the most powerful weapon of all. By late December 1944, the forests and narrow roads surrounding Bastogne had become one of the most dangerous battlefields in Europe. Snow covered the ground, the air was bitterly cold, and visibility was often limited by fog drifting between the tall pine trees. In these conditions, armored combat rarely happened at long distances. Instead, tanks and armored vehicles often encountered each other suddenly, sometimes at ranges so short that crews had only seconds to react. German armored units moving through the region relied heavily on powerful vehicles like the Panther tank. On paper, the Panther had enormous advantages. Its thick, sloped armor made it extremely difficult to destroy from the front, and its high-velocity gun could knock out most Allied armored vehicles from well over a kilometer away. German crews were trained to use these strengths by engaging enemies at long range, where their firepower and protection could dominate the battlefield. But the terrain around Bastogne did not favor long-range combat. The forests and rolling hills of the Ardennes created narrow corridors of movement where tanks often had little room to maneuver. Roads twisted between trees and villages, forcing vehicles into long columns. Visibility was restricted, and sudden turns in the road could bring opposing forces face to face with almost no warning. It was in this environment that American tank destroyer crews operating the M18 Hellcat began using their greatest advantage: speed. Instead of waiting in fixed defensive positions, Hellcat crews often moved constantly, searching for opportunities to strike German armor from unexpected directions. One typical encounter might begin with a German column advancing slowly along a forest road. Panthers and other armored vehicles would move carefully, scanning the tree line for signs of enemy activity. From inside the tank, the crew's view was limited by small vision ports and periscopes. Snow, fog, and shadows between the trees made it even harder to spot hidden threats. Meanwhile, somewhere off the road, a Hellcat crew might already be waiting. Because the vehicle was lighter and faster than most tanks, it could move quickly through secondary paths, open fields, or narrow village streets. The crew would often position themselves where they could see the side of an approaching German tank rather than its heavily armored front. The moment the target appeared, the Hellcat's gunner would aim for the vulnerable side armor. At close range, the 76mm gun had a much better chance of penetrating. The commander might shout the order to fire, and within seconds, the shot would echo through the forest. If the shells struck correctly, the result could be devastating. But the moment after firing was often the most dangerous. German crews inside nearby Panthers would immediately begin searching for the source of the attack. Their turret could rotate toward the flash of the gun, and if they spotted the Hellcat quickly enough, their powerful main gun could destroy the lighter vehicle with a single hit. This was where speed became the Hellcat's greatest protection. The instant the shot was fired, the driver would often accelerate away from the firing position. The vehicle could reverse behind trees, dash down another road, or relocate to an entirely different ambush point before the German crews could fully react. To the German tankers, the experience could be extremely confusing. A shot might come from the left side of the road, striking one of the vehicles in the column. As the remaining tanks turned their turrets toward that direction, another shot might suddenly arrive from somewhere else entirely. In reality, only one or two Hellcats might be involved, but their constant movement created the illusion that multiple American units were attacking at once. Some German reports from the fighting in the Ardennes described encounters where Panther crews believed they were facing large groups of enemy tank destroyers. In reality, a small number of fast vehicles had simply repositioned several times during the engagement. Each new firing position made it appear as if a different unit had joined the fight. American crews quickly learned to exploit this confusion. Instead of staying in one place, they would move rapidly between firing positions, using the terrain for cover. Buildings, trees, and small hills allowed them to break line of sight with enemy tanks. Once hidden, they could circle around and appear again from another direction. The forests around Bastogne made these tactics particularly effective. Unlike open terrain where long-range guns dominated, the close environment of the woods forced tanks into sudden encounters where reaction time mattered more than armor thickness. A tank that could destroy enemies at great distances might suddenly find itself attacked from the side at only a few dozen meters. Communication between Hellcat crews also played an important role. Using radios, commanders could warn nearby vehicles about approaching German armor and coordinate ambushes. 2 or 3 tank destroyers working together could create a deadly trap along a road or crossroads. One vehicle might fire first to draw attention, while another waited quietly in a flanking position for the perfect shot. These battles were intense and often extremely short. In many cases, the entire engagement lasted only a few minutes before one side withdrew or was destroyed. Smoke from burning vehicles could drift between the trees, while the sound of engines and gunfire echoed across the frozen landscape. For the soldiers involved, the fighting felt unpredictable and dangerous. A quiet forest road could suddenly become a battlefield within seconds. Tank crews remained constantly alert, scanning the terrain for movement or flashes of gunfire that might reveal an enemy position. Despite the risks, the mobility of the Hellcat allowed American crews to challenge heavier German armor in ways that traditional tanks could not. By refusing to fight on the enemy's terms and instead relying on speed and surprise, these crews turned the battlefield into a constant contest of movement. In the snowy forests around Bastogne, armor thickness alone no longer guaranteed survival. The tank that moved faster, reacted quicker, and struck first often controlled the outcome of the encounter. And again during these tense winter battles, the fast American tank destroyers proved that agility could sometimes overcome even the most powerful armored machines.
As the bitter winter of 1944 stretched on, the battle around Bastogne had become a deadly chess game of armored warfare. German Panther tanks, with their thick, sloped armor and powerful guns, were still formidable on paper, but the reality of the Ardennes terrain was beginning to expose their weaknesses. Narrow roads, forests, and snow-covered fields limited their mobility and made them vulnerable to fast-moving opponents who could strike and disappear before retaliation was possible. What had begun as Germany's last great gamble in the West was slowly transforming into a test of maneuver, speed, and tactical creativity. American tank destroyers, especially the M18 Hellcats, had demonstrated a new kind of battlefield effectiveness. Instead of relying on thick armor to survive, these vehicles relied on speed, timing, and coordination. Crews learned to exploit every twist of the road, every tree line, and every ridge to attack Panthers from the side or rear, where the heavy tanks were most vulnerable. The rapid strikes and constant movement created confusion among German crews, who often reported being attacked by much larger numbers of vehicles than were actually present. One Hellcat, operating with precision and timing, could make the enemy believe they were facing a battalion, when in reality it was only a handful of vehicles. The lessons of Bastogne extended beyond the immediate fight. Commanders on both sides began to see that mobility could sometimes outweigh raw firepower. German heavy tanks, so effective in the open plains of the Eastern Front, could be frustrated by terrain and tactics that emphasized rapid repositioning. American forces, by contrast, had demonstrated that a lighter, faster vehicle with a well-trained crew could achieve results that heavier armor alone could not. It was a paradigm shift in armored warfare. Speed, initiative, and tactical surprise could redefine the balance of power on the battlefield. The human element was also crucial. The bravery, discipline, and ingenuity of the American crews operating in freezing conditions cannot be overstated. Many spent hours exposed to sub-zero temperatures in open-topped vehicles, scanning for signs of enemy armor while enduring artillery fire and snowstorms. Their endurance, combined with the vehicle's advantages, allowed them to operate effectively where other forces might have stalled.
These small, coordinated units often became the deciding factor in local engagements, holding key roads and delaying German advances long enough for larger reinforcements to arrive. Patton's rapid maneuver of the Third Army had also proved its worth. By moving hundreds of thousands of troops and vehicles northward through difficult winter conditions, he reinforced Bastogne at a critical moment. The combination of aggressive leadership, logistical planning, and flexible tactics created a situation where the Germans' initial advantages in armor and surprise were gradually eroded. Each passing day allowed the Allies to consolidate positions, resupply their troops, and bring additional firepower to bear, slowly tipping the balance back in their favor. By the time the snow began to melt and the fog lifted, the battle around Bastogne had become a defining moment in the Ardennes offensive. The German attack, once seen as potentially war-changing, had stalled. Heavy tanks that had initially punched deep into American lines were now facing relentless counterattacks, ambushes, and harassment by fast-moving vehicles and infantry. The myth of invincible armor had been challenged, and lessons in maneuver warfare, speed, and adaptability had been indelibly impressed upon both sides. Historians studying Bastogne often emphasize that this was not a story of overwhelming force alone. It was a story of how small, agile units, clever tactics, and bold leadership could influence the outcome of a major battle. The Hellcat tank destroyers, with their unmatched speed and surprising lethality, became symbols of this approach. German crews, for all their training and powerful vehicles, found themselves contending with a foe that could strike unpredictably and vanish, turning the battlefield into a relentless contest of movement. The legacy of Bastogne continued long after the battle ended. American armored doctrine increasingly valued mobility, rapid response, and coordinated maneuver over simply fielding the heaviest vehicles possible. The lessons learned in these forests under freezing skies would inform armored tactics for decades, influencing the design of future tanks and the strategies employed in conflicts across the globe. In the end, the Ardennes campaign showed that even in the harshest conditions, with snow and fog and the looming threat of powerful enemy armor, a combination of speed, initiative, and strategic planning could change the course of a battle. The Hellcat crews, Patton's decisive leadership, and the ingenuity of American forces demonstrated that momentum and maneuver could overcome raw strength. Bastogne became more than just a battle. It became a case study in how warfare could evolve when mobility and tactical intelligence were placed above brute force. And as winter receded, the lessons of the frozen Ardennes continued to resonate, shaping the way commanders thought about tanks, speed, and the art of armored warfare for generations to come.